First contact. The day the Cox arrived started like any other, until it didn't. At the Field Museum in Chicago, excited fourth graders pressed their faces against the windows, eager to begin their field trip. Their teacher, Mrs. Thompson, smiled at their enthusiasm. In the museum's research wing, Dr. Raymond Chen stared blearily at his computer screen. As the field's head xenobiologist, his job mainly involved categorizing new extremophile bacteria. Actual aliens were strictly theoretical. All that changed at 10:47 a.m. when a twisting mass of bioorganic material, pulsing with sickly bioluminescence, came screaming through the atmosphere. It crashed into the museum parking lot, obliterating a row of school buses. Alarms blared as the museum went into lockdown. Dr. Chen stared out his window in disbelief as the first Cox emerged from the wreckage. They looked like giant praying mantises crossed with medieval armor, their exoskeletons shimmering purple and green. Despite the situation, a thrill ran through him. First contact. Outside, Chicago PD had surrounded the ship, weapons drawn. Lieutenant James Martinez readied his megaphone, hands shaking slightly. On behalf of the human race, welcome to Earth. Dr. Chen called out, stepping forward with his hands raised in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. We mean you no harm. The lead Cox, larger than the others with more elaborate patterns on its carapace, cocked its head at an unnatural angle. It made a sound like a garbage disposal eating a fork. Great, they speak disposal, Martinez muttered. Anyone got a universal translator? The tension stretched like a rubber band ready to snap. Then the screaming started. Dr. Chen whirled around to see Mrs. Thompson's class banging on the glass, their eyes wide with wonder and terror. The Cox's reaction was immediate and horrifying. Patterns flashing crimson, the aliens raised weapon appendages that pulsed with malevolent energy. Dr. Chen shouted a warning, but too late. The Cox opened fire on the museum windows, directly targeting the area where the children stood. Only the fast reflexes of a security guard hitting the emergency blast doors saved the students' lives. The reinforced barriers slammed down just as the first volley of bioweapons spattered against them, hissing and spitting. The glass began to bubble and run like wax. Acid rounds. Chen yelled over the din of shouts and weapons fire. And they're shooting at children. He flung himself behind a concrete barrier as a barrage of projectiles sizzled overhead. His mind raced. This was no misunderstanding. The Cox were deliberately targeting the young. All around, the scene dissolved into chaos. Sirens blared as SWAT teams and National Guard units rolled in, only to find themselves woefully outgunned. The Cox's exoskeletons shrugged off bullets like rain. And then, cutting through the din, a new sound. The aliens were harmonizing, a keening wail that bypassed the ears and drilled into the brainstem. Dr. Chen clamped his hands over his ears, but couldn't block out the horrible images suddenly flooding his mind. Inside the museum, children collapsed, blood trickling from their noses. Mrs. Thompson hammered frantically on the blast door controls to no avail. Dr. Chen caught his sister's eye across the battlefield. Admiral Chen of the newly formed Extraterrestrial Defense Force gave a grim nod, then spoke into her comlink. Authorization Chen Alpha 9er. Deploy EMP. The electromagnetic pulse hit like a thunderclap. The Cox's bioluminescence died. Their weapons fell silent. For a moment, all was still. Then the real battle began. As the military opened up with experimental plasma cannons, Dr. Chen's heart sank. Dozens of children lay comatose, their minds shattered by the psychic assault. Maybe permanently. Suddenly, the Cox's motives didn't matter. Their origins, their technology, all his endless fascination with alien life, none of it meant a thing. They had targeted Earth's children. And for that, there could be no forgiveness, no compromise. Only war. Only vengeance. Humanity had just found the one thing that could unite it. And the stars would tremble. Nemesis Protocol. In the aftermath of the Cox attack, the world held its breath. 37 children lay comatose in hospitals across Chicago, their minds invaded by an alien psychic assault. Entire communities gathered in candlelight vigils, praying for a miracle. But behind closed doors, a new alliance was forming. One born of grief, rage, and implacable resolve. The UN Security Council convened an emergency session, with the entire world watching. Representatives from every nation set aside their squabbles and rivalries. Only one thing mattered now. They targeted our children, Admiral Chen told the somber council. Her voice shook with barely constrained fury. This was no tragic misunderstanding, no accident of first contact. Recovered data from their ship confirms it. Hunting the young of sentient species is what they do. It's all they do. Murmurs rippled through the council chamber, quickly silenced as the admiral raised a hand. We cannot abide this. We will not. The Cox have, through their actions, declared war on all humanity. I move to immediately initiate Nemesis Protocol. The vote was swift and unanimous. For the first time in history, Earth was united against an external threat. An enemy that all of humanity could agree must be destroyed. Dr. Raymond Chen watched his sister's speech from his lab in Chicago. He couldn't share her certainty. Yes, the attack was unforgivable. But to declare a xenocidal war based on one hostile encounter. With a technology so far beyond theirs. It seemed like madness. He turned back to his analysis of the Cox weapons. The biochemistry was fascinating, elegant even. Such a waste, to be turned toward such evil ends. If they could capture more samples, reverse engineer it. The door banged open, jolting him out of his musings. Admiral Chen strode in, her face a thundercloud. We need a countermeasure for their psychic attack, she said without preamble. Something to stop more kids from ending up like. Her jaw clenched. Dr. Chen knew she was thinking of her own daughter, currently sedated in the pediatric ICU. I'm working on it, he said. But their neurotechnology is decades beyond us. It interfaces directly with the brain's electrical fields. I don't know if. Figure it out, she snapped. You're supposed to be the expert. That's why I brought you in on this. Dr. Chen bridled at her tone. Being the kid brother of the hero of the Chicago incursion, as the media had dubbed her, was already a lot to live up to. He didn't need her questioning his abilities on top of it. I'll do my best, he said stiffly. But we need more data. More Cox technology to study. The Admiral smiled thinly. Oh, don't worry. You'll get your samples. We're going hunting. The shipyard buzzed with activity as technicians swarmed over the latest prototypes. Sleek attack craft equipped with reverse-engineered alien tech. EMP cannons. Plasma beams. Grav drives that could dance circles around the lumbering Cox bioships. It had been 2 months since the attack. 2 months of frenzied construction, feverish innovation. Earth's combined military-industrial might have been unleashed with a single purpose. Total war against the Cox. Admiral Chen stood on an observation deck, watching her strike force take shape. Nemesis Protocol was bearing deadly fruit. An alert chimed on her comlink. She glanced at the message, then allowed herself a wolfish grin. Long-range scans had detected a Cox ship entering the solar system. Showtime. The Cox ship loomed in the void like a twisted sea urchin, its spines pulsing with malignant light. It dwarfed the human fighters swarming around it. But the Earth ships flitted like deadly gnats, peppering the behemoth with EMP and plasma. On the bridge of the flagship, Admiral Chen clenched her fist as another salvo struck home. The Cox's organic hull shuddered, ichor boiling into space from a dozen wounds. Their shields are down, her tactical officer crowed. Firing for effect. Lances of superheated plasma stabbed deep into the bioship's core. Secondary explosions rippled across its surface as its internal organs ruptured. A ragged cheer went up from the human crews. Against all odds, they were winning. The Cox ship wallowed, mortally stricken. Then the dying behemoth pulsed with a sickly crimson light. A sense of overwhelming wrongness flooded the minds of every human in range. The admiral gasped, doubling over. It felt like her skull was filled with broken glass and rotting meat. Dimly, she heard screams over the comm channels as other crew members succumbed. A psychic death scream. A final spite-filled blast to take them with it. She summoned every scrap of will to slam down mental shields Dr. Chen had devised. The pressure eased slightly. "Break off," she croaked into the fleet channel. "All ships, maximum distance." She sagged in her chair, head pounding, as her crew obeyed sluggishly. They'd won the battle. But the war had just taken an ugly new turn. They had learned to kill the Cox. Now they must learn to endure their dying curse. Because she knew, with grim certainty, that this was only the beginning. Nemesis Protocol was locked in. For Earth, for the comatose children, there could be no turning back. The Cox had sown the wind. Now they would reap the whirlwind. Pawn to queen. Dr. Raymond Chen stared at the brain scans in front of him, a sick feeling in his gut. The images showed the neural activity of the comatose children, but it was all wrong. Alien patterns danced across the cerebral cortex, clusters of neurons firing in unnatural synchrony. It reminded him of the Cox biotech he'd been reverse engineering. That same unholy melding of machinery and living tissue. "This isn't a coma," he murmured. "It's almost like an infection. Their brains have been rewired." He thought of the Cox's dying psychic scream, the reports of human crew driven to madness or suicide by the mental assault. A horrifying suspicion began to take shape. What if the children's minds hadn't been destroyed by the attack? What if they had been harvested? Stolen to power Cox weapons in some twisted neurotech synthesis? He needed more data. More samples. Right on cue, his lab door hissed open. But it wasn't his sister this time. A cold-eyed woman in a black uniform regarded him silently. "Dr. Chen," she said. "Your security clearance has just been upgraded. Come with me." Minutes later, he stood in a cavernous hangar deep beneath the Chicago megaplex. Rows of stasis pods lined the walls, each one containing a Cox corpse. "The spoils of war," his escort said, a hint of grim satisfaction in her voice. "Fresh from the front lines. We need you to extract every scrap of usable tech and biodata." Dr. Chen swallowed hard. It was exactly what he'd wanted. So why did it feel like a devil's bargain? With trembling hands, he initiated the first dissection sequence. Light years away, the Cox overseer brooded on its throne of pulsing flesh. Stubby tentacles caressed the input jack studding its atrophied body, supping the inflow of stolen neural energy. The power ripped from the minds of 100 conquered worlds. The agony and madness of 1 billion butchered young. Such a delicious vintage. And yet, the stream from the newest prize had gone sour. The immature minds of the Earthlings, once a delicacy to be savored, now burned like poison. Each battle against the upstart primates depleted the Overseer's forces. Thrall warriors and brood harvesters, millennia in the crafting, lost to the primates' crude but effective weapons. It was intolerable. The Cox were the apex predators of the galaxy. They couldn't be outfought by the equivalent of prey animals. There had to be a way to regain the upper hand. Inspiration struck like a lightning bolt. The Overseer keened in triumph, fleshy data shunts pulsing with malign purpose. It was time to spawn a new breed of warrior. One that blended the best of predator and prey. Let the humans reap what they had sown. The alert klaxon jolted Admiral Chen out of a fitful sleep. She jolted upright, already reaching for her uniform. "Report," she barked into the comm, tying back sleep-mussed hair with her other hand. New Cox incursion detected, her XO replied, voice tight. But, there's something different about this one. You better get up here. Minutes later, Chen strode onto the bridge, a cup of recycled coffee in hand. She frowned at the tactical display. A single Cox bioship hung in orbit over old Chicago. A direct challenge. What's different about it? She asked. Her exec shook his head. Scans aren't making sense. It's a Cox ship, but the biosignature. He trailed off as a new alert sounded. They're launching something, the sensor tech reported. Some kind of drop pods. Heading straight for the city. Chen felt a chill down her spine. Chicago. Where the captured Cox tech was being studied. Where her brother was. Scramble interceptors. And get me a line to the Zenitech lab, now. Smoke billowed from the ruined husk of the lab. Dr. Chen coughed, dragging himself out of the rubble. His right arm dangled uselessly, shattered by falling debris. The attack had come out of nowhere. One moment he was elbow deep in Cox viscera, the next the world had dissolved in fire and screams. He staggered through the bodies of human security forces, their weapons useless against this new horror. Because what strode through the smoke and ruin was no mere Cox thrall. It was an abomination. A thing that wore a plasteel mockery of SWAT armor over a chitinous exoskeleton. Grafted into one arm was a Cox plasma weapon. The other clutched a crackling stun baton. But worst of all was the face that leered from beneath the riot helmet. Blue human eyes in a mantis skull. A Cox with the face of a human child. The hybrid raised its weapon arm, bioluminescent barrel pulsing as it charged. Dr. Chen closed his eyes, waiting for the killing blast. It never came. The creature jerked, sparks cascading from a hole that suddenly appeared in its skull. It toppled, revealing a familiar black-clad figure. Nap time's over, little brother, Admiral Chen said grimly, lowering her still-smoking sidearm. We've got work to do. She hauled him upright, eyes widening at his mangled arm. You'll live. Can't say the same for these poor bastards. She nudged a fallen Cox hybrid with her boot. Its dead eyes stared accusingly from a child's face. Dr. Chen swallowed bile. They're using them. The comatose kids. Fusing them with Cox DNA to make abominations, the Admiral finished. Her face was stone. And that ship up there? It's full of them. A whole invasion force of monster children. Dr. Chen's mind raced. The implications were staggering. And horrifying. It's our own fault, he whispered. All this time we thought we were winning. But we were just their incubators. Our hate, our vengeance, we fed right into their plans. Hate. Admiral Chen's eyes unfocused, seeing a hospital room and a daughter who might never wake. Yes. We'll show them what human hate can do. She keyed her comm link. Nemesis Prime, this is Valkyrie Actual. Initiate Ragnarok Protocol. Authorization, let them burn. On the bridge of Nemesis Prime, the crew exchanged uneasy glances. Ragnarok was the final option. A world killer. But after the image of those hybrid abominations, wearing the faces of stolen children, flickered across every screen on Earth, there was no hesitation. Nemesis Prime, the chariot of humanity's wrath, rolled out to deliver fiery judgment. Dr. Chen watched the monitor from a hastily erected command center. On screen, the Cox battle-brewed ship squatted obscenely over Chicago's skyline. They'll never know what hit them, Admiral Chen growled. It's time to show these child-stealing bastards what it means to piss off the human race. As she spoke, Nemesis Prime lanced into view. It was a blocky ugly thing, all brutal functionality. But to Dr. Chen's eyes, it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. The dreadnought's bow split open, revealing the maw of a singularity cannon. A weapon to make a black hole blush. The doctor felt a grim smile tug his lips even as his heart ached. How many stolen children were aboard that ship? No. Not children. Not anymore. The Cox had seen to that. All that remained was to balance the scales. An eye for an eye. Let the Cox reap what they had sown. Fire, the Admiral whispered. And the world went white. No more half measures. When the glare faded, nothing remained of the Cox ship but an expanding cloud of plasma. The twisted wreckage of hybrid bodies tumbled through the atomic flames, disintegrating even as they burned. On the ground, Dr. Chen watched the carnage unfold with a numb sense of detachment. It was over. They had won. So why did it feel like they had lost everything? He turned away from the screen, unable to bear the sight any longer. Admiral Chen was barking orders, coordinating cleanup and quarantine efforts. Making sure no surviving abomination could threaten Earth again. But he knew it was futile. The true threat wasn't a few twisted hybrids. It was the cold reality of a universe where such things could exist. Where children could be stolen and corrupted, turned into weapons against their own kind. The Cox had shown them the true face of the cosmos. And it was ugly beyond reckoning. In the following weeks, Earth's resolve hardened into something implacable and diamond-sharp. The images of the child things had seared themselves into every human heart. There could be no mercy, no respite. Only vengeance. Only total war. Nemesis Prime was just the beginning. More dreadnoughts rolled off the assembly lines, each one larger and more devastating than the last. Singularity cannons became standard armament for Earth's war fleet. N-dimensional implosion bombs. Entropy cascades that could unravel stars. No weapon was too terrible, no tactic too ruthless. Because the alternative was unthinkable. Humanity's children would never be victims again. Under the shadow of this ever-growing arsenal, Dr. Chen worked tirelessly to unravel the secrets of Cox biotech. He would take the tools they had used to corrupt human children and turn them against their makers. His lab became equal parts workshop and charnel house as he dissected Cox corpses and studied the remains of their abominable hybrids. He learned the intricacies of their neural harvesters, their gene binders, the psionic frequency of their very thoughts. And in the darkest vault of his mind, a plan began to take shape. A final solution to the Cox problem. All he needed was a test subject. The overseer writhed on its throne, keening in agony as its data shunts burned with feedback. The humans. The wretched, savage primates. What had they done? The Earth fleets were carving a path of ruin through Cox space, every world they touched left a burned and lifeless husk. Entire broods, lovingly sculpted over eons to be the perfect hunters, were snuffed out between one breath and the next. The Overseer's beautiful new hybrids were blasted to atoms before they could even be deployed. The stolen neural patterns of 1 billion children guttered and faded as their repositories were annihilated one by one. It was ruin. It was desolation. And yet, the true horror was yet to come. Admiral Chen's eyes were coals set in pits of shadow as she watched the Cox throne world burn. The seat of their vile empire, the source of all their power, just another mote of light swallowed by humanity's vengeance. But she took no satisfaction in it. Because she knew what must come next. "You're sure about this?" she asked, not turning from the viewport. "There's no other way." Dr. Chen stepped up beside her, his face gaunt and haunted. In his hand he held a simple data drive. "I'm sure," he said hoarsely. "The Overseer is still out there. As long as it lives, as long as one scrap of its neurotech exists, our children will never be safe. And this will end it?" She nodded at the drive, disgust and desperate hope warring in her voice. "It's a psychic resonance bomb," he said flatly. "Tuned to the unique neural pattern of the Overseer. It will turn every Cox mind in the galaxy into a conduit for searing agony, and then burn them out like candles in a thunderstorm. The Admiral closed her eyes. Genocide. That's what they were talking about. The eradication of an entire species, not just their physical forms but the very patterns of their thoughts. It should have been unthinkable. But the Cox had stolen that luxury from them the day they touched Earth's children. Do it, she whispered. End them. Once and for all. Dr. Chen's hand shook as he slotted the drive into the console. One keystroke, and it would all be over. His finger hovered over the button. He thought of his niece, lying so small and broken in her hospital bed. Of all the stolen children, lost forever to alien madness. No more half measures. No more hesitation. He pressed the button. The overseer's scream threatened to shatter the fabric of reality itself. Agony beyond imagining ripped through every synapse, every neuron aflame with incandescent anguish. And it was not alone. Across the galaxy, every Cox mind linked to the neurotech web convulsed as one. Thrall warriors clawed at their own skulls, ichor gushing from ruptured eye sockets. Brood harvesters shriveled and died, their grotesque wombs desiccating as the twisted embryos within boiled in their own amniotic fluid. One by one, the lights of Cox consciousness guttered out. A choir of silent screams fading into oblivion. The overseer clung to awareness the longest, a shipwrecked sailor drowning in a sea of pain. It beheld the ruin of its species, the glorious mindweb reduced to ash and echoes. In its last moment, it beheld the face of its destroyer. A simple primate, staring back from the depths of a machine god's heart. Staring with eyes that held the coldness of extinguished stars. Eyes that promised no mercy, no respite. Only the void. Only oblivion. The overseer's mind shattered like glass. And the Cox were no more. Embers of yesterday. Silence reigned in the control room. On the screen, the last few sparks of Cox brainwaves flickered and died, their neurotech web collapsing into nothingness. It was done. The Cox were extinct, their very thought patterns scoured from the cosmos. Dr. Chen sagged against the console, a marionette with its strings cut. He stared at his hands, half expecting to see blood dripping from them. What have I done? He whispered. What have I become? Admiral Chen laid a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm but not unkind. You did what had to be done, she said quietly. What we all had to do. There was no other choice. Wasn't there? He looked up at her, eyes haunted. We've wiped out an entire species, Alex. Committed genocide on a galactic scale. How are we any different from the monsters we just destroyed? The Admiral was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was heavy with grief. We're different because we didn't want this, she said at last. The Cox reveled in slaughter, in stealing the minds of children. We just wanted to protect what was ours. She looked out at the stars, at the infinite darkness between them. Maybe that's the only thing that ever really separates the monsters from the righteous. The weight of the sins we carry. Earth rejoiced in the weeks that followed. The news of the Cox's annihilation was met with an outpouring of relief and savage joy. Spontaneous celebrations erupted in the streets, the skies alight with fireworks as if to mirror the funeral pyres of 1 billion Cox. But for those who had stood at the tip of the spear, who had seen the face of total war and felt its icy breath on their souls, there was no joy. Only a numb, hollow ache where triumph should have been. Dr. Chen threw himself into his work with a manic intensity, as if he could outrun the ghosts that haunted him. He split his time between developing new medical techniques to heal the comatose children and crafting ever more deadly weapons for Earth's arsenal. Let the masses celebrate. He would make sure humanity was never caught unprepared again. Admiral Chen retreated into the cold comfort of duty. She drilled her forces mercilessly, honing them into a blade that could shear through the hide of the cosmos itself. If other threats lurked out there in the void, they would find humanity a fearsome predator in its own right. But sometimes, in the long watches of the night, her hand would drift to the locket at her throat. To the tiny hollow within, a young girl's smiling face frozen in happier times. A reminder of what she had lost. What they had all lost, in the flames of vengeance. Months turned to years. The scars left by the cock slowly began to heal, life returning to a semblance of normality. But the specter of the war still hung over all. In the gleaming orbital defense platforms that ringed the earth, bristling with weapons that could split the heavens. In the hardened look in every soldier's eyes, a coiled readiness that never quite faded. And in the labs deep beneath the Chicago megaplex, where Dr. Chen and his team worked tirelessly to unravel the secrets of Cox Biotech. To turn the weapons of nightmare into tools of hope. It was there, amidst the whirring centrifuges and bubbling vats of reclaimed biomatter, that the miracle finally happened. A child opened her eyes. Mira Chen blinked up at the sterile white ceiling, confusion writ plain on her delicate features. The last thing she remembered was the museum, the monsters, the screaming. A choked sound made her turn her head. Her mother was there, tears streaming down her face as she clutched Myra's hand like a lifeline. "Mommy?" Mira whispered, voice rusty from disuse. "What happened? Where am I?" Admiral Chen couldn't speak, couldn't form words around the lump in her throat. She just gathered her little girl into her arms, feeling the warmth of her, the steady thrum of her heartbeat. Dr. Chen watched from the doorway, his own eyes suspiciously bright. He had done it. The neurotech regeneration protocols had worked. One by one, the stolen children were coming back to them. But even as joy suffused him, a cold sliver of dread wormed in his gut. The Cox were gone, but their legacy remained. In the scars left on innocent souls, in the brutal calculus of genocide. And in the dark seed of potential that lurked in every human mind. The capacity for ruthlessness, for total annihilation of that which threatened what they held dear. The Cox, in their hubris, had thought to make weapons of human children. But all they had done was reveal the weapon that lurked in humanity itself. The willingness to do anything, sacrifice anything, to protect their own. Dr. Chen looked out the window, to the stars that glittered cold and pitiless in the void. What other threats lurked out there, he wondered. What other horrors waited to test the mettle of the human soul? He didn't know. None of them did. But one thing was certain. When the next threat came, when the darkness gathered once more, humanity would be ready. For they had learned the cost of innocence. And they would never be prey again.